Today I'm going to tell a story in which my brother, Theodore Parker, known as Ted by his friends and acquaintances, is the main character. You may know, or you may not know, but my brother was a very important naturalist, an ornithologist, an ecologist during his lifetime, which ended when a plane crashed while he was doing his research in Ecuador. But he spent 20 years in the rainforest and in the Andes determining by a new formula, a new method, the density of fauna in the South American continent. And his achievements in that area are legendary. He was the first scientist of Conservation International, the head scientist of that institution, which is of enormous importance in environmental science. He found birds new to science that had never been seen before by Westerners. And he knew more about the sound and songs of birds than probably anybody ever in the history of ornithology. And he left behind over 10,000 recordings of bird sounds for the Cornell University Library, which specializes in that quality. I could talk about him for the whole time today, but I want to tell a story in which he's a character which represents something that will help you understand his nature. When I was a child, because my brother had such great authority about the study of birds, even when he was 10 years old or 12 years old, because he already was almost like an adult scientist at a young age, keeping field notes and making maps and doing elaborate drawings and recordings of birds, even at this very tender age. Because of that, he told me, I don't think you should study birds. I think we should divide and conquer, and you should spend your time studying reptiles and amphibians, things that are on the ground. After all, he said, your vision isn't that good, and you really can't see things at a distance, and you're not that good at sounds, and you have deficiencies, which was putting it mildly. So why don't you study things that are, under rocks and on the ground and be more in tune with your skills, which was a very mixed compliment. So I did so. And John McDermott, whose father was a professor of biology at Franklin and Marshall College, and I became weekly, in the warm months of the year in Pennsylvania, we became weekly herpetological adventurers. And we spent all of our time looking for salamanders, turtles, snakes, the very few lizards that live in Pennsylvania. There's only 1 or 2 species. And this was an enormous part of our childhood. In my case, I thought salamanders were the most interesting of all the reptiles and amphibians. They're secretive, they're colorful, they're mysterious, they're difficult to find. There's many, many species in Pennsylvania. In fact, this side of the Piedmont Plateau and the Appalachians are the place where the salamanders are most populous, probably, if not in the world, at least in North America. So we could see many, many species of salamanders. And one that I particularly wanted to see when I was small, I think when I was about 11, I had already seen many, many species of salamander. I'd seen the redback and the two-lined and the spotted and other common species, the dusky salamander. I'd seen and many others, but I had not yet seen the red salamander, Pseudatorum ruber, which is a very beautiful salamander, one of the most beautiful salamanders in North America. It has a bright coral fuchsia coloring when it's in its middle age, and when it gets a little older, the black spots on its back kind of blur together. It gets duller, but at one phase of its life, it's one of the most beautiful of all salamanders, and I longed to see this salamander. I knew that it lived in streams that had clay bottoms, and not the kind of muddy, soft bottom streams that were very common in Pennsylvania. So whenever I saw this kind of habitat, this kind of granular clay, I thought, the red salamander. Well, I was one day in Pinchot Park, named for Gifford Pinchot, who was Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior and one of the most important conservationists in American history. And I was in Pinchot Park, you know, which is in York County, the sister county of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And in the park, I was walking at 4 or 5 in the afternoon on a pretty late in the season fall day, maybe in September, late September, where salamanders mostly had receded, and we only saw a few during the whole day. But at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, a few minutes before we were supposed to turn back for home, I picked up a flat rock. And under it I saw, after the clay clarified, after the muddy swirl under the rock clarified, I saw the red salamander in living person for the first time, and this was a thrilling moment. And I had a little 10-inch dip net in my hand, and I tried to capture it, but it escaped. And before I tell you what my brother said to me, which is really the kernel and point of this story, let me just make a point here about education. I think that parents or any adults who are interested in educating children, adolescents, they should realize there's probably nothing more fruitful than natural history. It seems to be one of the 2 or 3 most automatically interesting subjects of the human mind for people who are of a young age. Living animals, living in the very environment in which we grow up, in our own home counties, hometowns. That's a fascinating thing, that these creatures, reptiles and amphibians, fish, insects, birds, mammals, that they live so close to us. They have fascinating names. They can organize our thoughts into genus and species in the biological sense, or just in the logical sense, where we see bigger groups and smaller groups. Probably nothing is more useful to the growing mind than to learn the names, the appearances, the habits, the range of these creatures, because I think they have an intrinsic fascination as the other living things in the created world, and there's just a natural interest in them. And it's a natural interest that maybe is the way to stoke curiosity in a world where curiosity seems to be a dying thing. So I bracket my comments to say that I think parents and friends and teachers should realize that nothing is a more fruitful tool for producing curiosity and an interest in learning than natural history. In fact, I remember in the brief time I talked to Czeslaw Milosz, who is a great Polish poet, Nobel laureate, one of the most important poetry writers of the 20th century. He told me that he thought that natural history and the observing of plates and the memorizing of names and the searching in the wild for animals, he said he thought was probably the most fruitful activity in youth. And he remembers himself that he could never have been a poet if he hadn't gone through that phase of imagination. And I thought this was a very interesting comment on his part. And he was still reflecting on this when he was 85 years old. So his whole life he'd thought back on this important fact. I remember that in Abraham Lincoln's letters, he talked about looking at the charts and engravings of butterflies and moths with his children, because that would give them an interest in the things of the world. And this is a thing that people should realize. Another way to go is dinosaurs, because that's just the same kind of creatures put into a fantastic past, a remote and lost past. So back to our story, I lost the red salamander, it disappeared, and I went to my brother and I said to him, I saw the red salamander, but I tried to capture it, and I've lost it, and now nobody will believe that I saw it. Nobody will believe it. It could have been a wonderful pet. I could have shown it to our friends. It was so beautiful. And now, look, who's going to believe? My brother said something to me which I've never forgotten the rest of my life. I mentioned it recently when I was working on my memoir of our childhood. He said to me, you know, Blan, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks about what you've done in your life, what you've seen, what you've understood, what you've discovered, what constitutes your important experiences. The only person that has to know is yourself. And as long as you know in your own mind that you've seen the red salamander in the wild and you've had that experience, you don't have to share it with anybody else to make it real, because it's an experience so much of your own life and a discovery so important to yourself that it's of absolutely no importance. It's trivial to wonder or care if anybody else will believe it. And I realized something at that moment, that the kind of selfless, personal, concentrated devotion and interest to nature that my brother had that so transcended the normal kind of attitude toward learning and toward thinking about these objects. And that moment taught me something in life which has stayed with me now for over 50 years.